you very much. Is the mic working or should I speak into this? Excellent. Wonderful. My name is Seán Hegarty. I'm coming from the University of Cambridge. We have a group there who are working on futures, governance and risk relating to artificial intelligence. And it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about, well, how predictable can we make AI systems, but also can we say anything meaningful about progress in AI and the future of AI? What we're going to be talking about today is the very beginning of a study on the role of foresight and forecasting in AI. So I hope you'll forgive us if it's a little bit loose. We're hoping to provide a few thoughts and have a starting point for conversations that we hope to be having over the course of the day. Progress in AI, as everyone in this room knows, is happening really quickly, and advances in AI are being felt right the way through a range of industries, from the impact of large language models on translation, coding, speech-to-text, graphic art, much more. All of us in universities are trying to figure out what we do about essays generated by ChatGPT. So there's an interest in having more accurate predictions for when certain capabilities might become available and what impact they might have on the world. So what kind of things might we want to forecast? And I've grabbed a few of the questions that are being currently or have recently been discussed on the Metaculus platform. And I think we're lucky to have somebody working with Metaculus here with us today who'll join us later. We might want to know when particular milestones or thresholds in research might be achieved, like when an AI system might surpass human performance of visual question answering on the VQA 2.0 dataset, or when an AI system might be able to outperform professional game testers on all Atari games without game-specific knowledge. We might want to forecast capabilities that could be dual use or introduce new kinds of risks. So if we're able to generate realistic videos, then suddenly we can create fake videos of, for example, politicians saying things that they didn't actually say. We might want to think about when AI systems could engage in deceptive behaviors when interacting with human beings. And we might want to predict when will people actually start using these systems for malicious purposes. And we had a wonderful talk this morning from Irina on sort of trend extrapolation. We might want to predict, well, how long will scaling laws hold? What kind of energy usage might we see going forward? Will we continue to see improvements in algorithmic efficiency? What kind of data will we need? How much data? Will we start running out of data at some point? This graph is a lovely one from a project called Epoch AI, which I'll mention later. And they've been graphing and trying to project the number of flops used in the training runs of milestone machine learning systems over time. And as everyone here knows, the biggest systems have been really going up in the amount of compute needed. So how might all this be useful if we had slightly more accurate predictions on them? Well, as Irina mentioned, it's becoming very, very expensive to train and run the biggest models. And so it'd be useful to start thinking ahead of time on what kind of resource, what kind of funding is needed. How do we make it so that academia and the nonprofit sectors don't end up getting completely cut out of progress on the latest cutting edge language models? How do we make sure that these sectors are actually able to engage in the research and meaningfully be able to understand and intervene on them? And so it's useful for government to know what kind of compute needs might that actually mean making available for academia? How much is that going to cost? We might want to think about what kind of expertise do we need, both in development processes, but also if you're in government, what kind of expertise do you need to be drawing on to really understand how to prepare for these things? It's worth starting to think about supply chains. If we're so dependent on things like large availability of compute, where do our chips come from? What are the supply chains? What are risks of those supply chains? And it's helpful to be able to think a little bit ahead about how to start shaping policy. AI is moving very quickly at the moment, and trying to figure out how to shape policy after it's out in the real world is a slow process and runs the risk of harms happening before we're able to intervene on them. having a sense for what might be coming allows us to start thinking about and initiating the process of thinking about how we protect people's data, how we make sure that the benefits of progress are available to people. It allows us to think about who are the stakeholders we need to be engaging with, which are the sectors that might be impacted by AI in the coming years, not just right now, so that we can actually involve them in the conversations around how they want their sectors to be affected, and how we make sure that they're empowered and have a role in actually shaping the beneficial applications of AI. All of these things can, in principle, be done after the fact, but if we have a little bit of a sense for what might be coming, we can do a little bit more ahead of time. It might be an indicator for longer-term questions. We talked a little bit earlier about making progress towards artificial general intelligence. Now, that's a difficult thing to forecast because it's predicting something that's very hard to define, where the definitions we use are different between different peoples and different groups, and it's an unprecedented development that we really have very little track record on. But maybe we can break down some of the steps along the way into things that we can say something a bit more meaningful on and have a little bit more of a sense for what kind of progress we're making. And perhaps if we see that communities of forecasters are doing very well on nearer term questions that we can verify, then if their predictions over time for further off developments are changing or updating, that tells us something that maybe we should be listening to. Lastly, I want to say a little bit about the relationship between forecasting and futures work more broadly. If we, and these are kind of straw man definitions, if we think of forecasting as trying to have accurate predictions about the future, futures work is more broadly about imagining a range of different futures that we could have. Sometimes we use scenarios to imagine, to think about, should certain developments come to pass, how might we act? What are the range of actions available to us? How might we interact with different sectors? What are the sorts of expertise that we'd want to have in the room to engage with these things? And what role do we have to shape these things? And forecasting work can certainly inform futures work by giving us a sense for what kind of scenarios we should lend quite a bit of weight to and what the characteristics would be. And similarly, futures work can in turn inform forecasting. So a quick run through of a very small number of the initiatives that are currently happening. I talked before about Metaculus, which I think is doing fantastic work. Metaculus is not limited to AI, but it has a thriving AI section. In addition to the questions I mentioned earlier, here are a couple of the ones that come up for me when I looked at it over the weekend. In 2025, what percentage of papers on archive will include reinforcement learning? What will the labour productivity growth rate be in 2023? Will there be laws in place that AI systems that emulate humans must reveal to people that they are AI by 2025, which is under discussion in places like the EU? When will a reinforcement learning agent match the best human performance in StarCraft 2 with no domain-specific hard-coded knowledge with particular hardware constraints? And how Metaculus works is it's got a community of thousands of forecasters, and Metaculus provides aggregated forecasts that update over time. And often a lot of the most interesting information, at least for me, comes from the discussion in which these forecasters kind of break down their reasoning, they introduce new facts, they debate them between each other. Another platform is Manifold Markets. Manifold is different in that it introduces the idea of play money. So there's some evidence that having some sort of stakes can improve the accuracy of forecasts. Now, people aren't putting their real money on the line, but they do have at least some kind of, play monetary incentive to get things right. And so they basically bet on the outcome of questions. A different approach to this is expert surveys. So for the last number of years, a group of researchers that has included people like Katja Grace of AI Impacts, Baobao Zhang, Alan Defoe of Oxford, Owen Evans, have been running surveys primarily of AI researchers. So the 2016 survey surveyed, I think they got answers from 352 AI researchers who'd published that year in NeurIPS and ICHKAI, I believe. And they asked a range of questions about, at what point might we expect AI to surpass human performance in playing Go, driving a truck, writing an essay to a high school level, and so on and so forth. And they've been running these. They've run 2 or 3 at this point. The most recent one had, I think, 200 and something responses. And a different approach that goes into a bit more depth has been this paper that I thought was really interesting by Carla Zoe Kramer, which came out a couple of years ago. And the approach she took was to go much more in depth on the limitations of deep learning, and particularly expert disagreement about the possibilities and limitations of deep learning. And there she uncovered that there was expert disagreement about whether deep learning systems might achieve capabilities like common sense reasoning, causal reasoning, whether they'd overcome challenges like catastrophic forgetting or being vulnerable to adversarial attacks. And that was another really fascinating way of sort of digging into a 25 or 30 person expert community and figuring out what they disagree about with regards to future progress and why. Another approach is trend modeling and extrapolation. And here I'm going to mention a project that I think has been doing some really interesting work in the last couple of years. This is directed by the excellent Jaime Sevilla, and Epoch AI has been basically modeling things like the number of flops in the biggest training runs from milestone AI systems. This top graph is looking at improvements in algorithmic efficiency. So they basically looked at the efficiency on a range of visual performance algorithms and found that every 9 months efficiency was improving to a level equivalent to the amount of compute needed halving. The bottom graph, they look at data needs, and they project that at some point in the not too distant future, we're just going to start running out of data. And there are some pretty wide error bars on that because it's kind of hard to estimate how much unlabeled data there is on the internet. But with the rate at which data needs are increasing, it does look like at some point data might be a limiting constraint. And as Irina laid out, if we're thinking about things like performance on the basis of scaling laws, and scaling laws break down into increased computing needs, increased data needs, then figuring out where we start hitting bottlenecks in terms of the sheer cost of these things, the availability of these resources starts to become quite important. And it starts raising questions like, are we just going to start hitting limitations with these systems? Is it going to become out of the realm of what anyone except a small number of very well-funded tech companies can do? Are we going to need to start relying on synthetic data, and what does that mean, and what might be the implications of it? So I think this is quite interesting work. I'll say a little bit about track record before I hand over to Alex, and we're just starting on this, so I can't say too much. Metaculus does keep track of the track record of its forecasters. It calculates a thing called a Breyer score, which is a sort of an analysis of the performance on probabilistic forecasts, and they find that their forecasters do actually quite well. A couple of days ago, a blog post went up looking at the performance of experts on that 2016 Katja Grace et al. Survey that I mentioned, and again found that the experts actually performed quite well. They predicted that by now 9 of a whole set of milestones that had been proposed would be achieved. It turns out 10 of them have been achieved at this point, but 9 is pretty close. And if they'd predicted these as having been achieved 18 months sooner or 18 months later, they would have performed quite a lot worse. So quite accurate. With that said, there are plenty of examples of predictions that haven't worked out well. I've got a paper with a few colleagues from 2013 where we looked at a whole range of older predictions right from the Dartmouth conference in the 1950s through to about 2010, and mainly we found that experts are very, very overconfident, particularly the further into the future we go. There's a general trend that if you can predict something to be 20 years or 25 years away. Basically, if you predict something to be at the point where you're retired and you can't be held to your prediction, those predictions are probably not going to be worth very much. Similarly, I was involved in setting up a study that has been very well cited on the impact of AI employment, led by Carl Frey and Mike Osborne, and I was looking back on that paper last night, and they predicted something like 47% of US categories of employment would be susceptible to employment or automation in the reasonably near future. I think there's probably been nothing like that, and actually some of the areas that they thought would be most susceptible to automation have remained fairly impervious. Progress on various sorts of robotics that would allow application to certain domains has been slower than expected, and some of the domains in which they said we are kind of safest from any sort of automation actually look like some of the most ripe for automation based on what we know right now. So, programming, tools like Copilot are definitely going to be quite useful in helping people do programming. Various sorts of kind of legal support, healthcare support, and so on look like there might be some pretty significant applications in the near future. And of course, many of us have been predicting that self-driving cars being all over the place within 2 years. We've been predicting that for many years and being proven wrong. So as the old adage goes, predicting is hard, especially about the future. But I think it's probably worth giving it a go anyway. At this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alex, who's going to speak a little bit more about the science and the pros and cons of forecasting. Thank you.
Could you switch the...
Yes, we just need to switch slide deck.
Oh, it's here. Okay.
And yours should be here.
There, perfect. Right, thanks, Sean. Let me just... Sorry, just the full screen. Yeah. All right. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sean. So now I'm going to go in a little bit more detail with what Sean was saying earlier about expertise and try to explore what the value of forecasting the future of AI could be beyond just accuracy. So Sean laid out, I think, a lot of reasons why we might be interested in predicting the future of AI. There are lots of advantages, especially if you can generate accurate predictions. But I think there's more to be said about predicting the future of AI than just generating accurate predictions about what will happen with compute and what will happen with other aspects of AI technologies. So one of the things I think we can achieve by systematically collecting judgments about the future of AI is we can find out who has the right expertise to think about the future of AI. So one finding that you see, so let me start this again. There's a lot of work on who counts as an expert in forecasting and foresight. Who is an expert? Who should we go to when we're thinking about the future? A recent survey of the literature kind of breaks it down into 3 different schools of thought. Experts in forecasting might be those who have the relevant PhDs and work in the relevant companies and have worked on the relevant projects and publish in the relevant journals, go to the right conferences, have highly cited papers. Another school of thought that is inspired more by work in behavioral sciences tends to be quite skeptical about individual performance, even expert performance, because we're all very susceptible to biases. Experts are just as susceptible as non-experts to biases. So we shouldn't put too much purchase on what experts are saying, despite having the right PhDs and writing the right papers. On this view, you try to find expertise not in the individual judgments of people, but rather in groups of people, and usually groups whose judgments are structured and whose interactions are structured in the right and clever way so as to avoid pernicious social effects. The third school of thought tries to look at how experts are thinking, what cognitive processes, what cognitive skills they have, and how they might differ from the cognitive abilities of non-experts, and try to identify expertise within the way experts approach problems. Now, despite there being some value in all of these views, I think so far our understanding is that if you want to know who's an expert on forecasting the future of any topic, you just have to look at track record. There are some things that you know correlate with accuracy. So sometimes for some questions in some competitions, we saw that we saw that credentials correlate, but this is usually not the case. There is some evidence that there are different cognitive skills that experts use and non-experts do not possess. But in general, the strongest signal we can have as to who's an expert in forecasting is track record. To give you 2 examples of how expertise might actually appear in unlikely places, one of the better known examples of forecasting tournament is the one that Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers ran as part of IARPA ACE on geopolitical forecasting. This is the work that led to the book on super forecasting that everybody has probably heard about. So in that study, the super forecasters, those who were most accurate, who outperformed the best experts, traditionally defined experts, and those who performed significantly better than chance, were individuals that you would not initially think of consulting when predicting geopolitical events. They were relatively highly skilled in terms of education, and they had a high level of educational attainment. However, they tended to work in law, in pharmacy, in venture capitalism, mathematics, not the people you'd expect to know stuff about next year's general elections in Mexico, for instance. In a study that I've just put on the meta-archive last month, we looked at forecasting the outcome of replication studies in the social sciences, and we consulted both a population of traditionally defined experts, people with PhDs in social science and quantitative social science, but also a population of undergraduate students, first-year and second-year students, who had usually around 1 course in statistics or in a methods discipline. And what we found was that although the 2 groups differed widely in terms of expertise, number of publications, age, performance on all kinds of standardized tests, there was no difference in accuracy between the 2 groups. The students performed just as well as the early career and senior career researchers did. Moreover, their judgments over the whole range of questions we asked were highly correlated. So in this case, it seemed like having a PhD in statistics doesn't give you a better understanding of what studies replicate and what studies don't replicate, which is worrying for all kinds of reasons. But in general, if we were to systematically collect judgments about the future of AI, one thing we could do is we can build a track record and finally pinpoint which communities we should go to and ask about the future of AI. Who are the right experts? And it might be people who work in tech companies, but it might just be people who do completely different things that are not connected to AI development and that just have an ability to think into the future and foresee where the science is going. A second reason why we might want to systematically collect predictions about the future of AI is that by doing this, we can build motivated, engaged communities to think about these issues. Now, one thing that you see in all the forecasting platforms, forecasting competitions, all the forecasting exercises out there is that, first of all, they're a magnet for people who have an inherent motivation to think about the issues that are being forecasted. So first of all, you get the attention of those who might not otherwise work on this, but they're interested in this, to come and start thinking with others about the future of AI in this case, or the future of or geopolitical events, or whatever you're forecasting. And then what you notice on all of these platforms and in all of these competitions, so you see it on Metaculus, you see it on Manifold, and you see it in the super forecasting study that Phil ran with Barb Mellers, you employ a lot of strategies to take this inherent motivation and build on it and create a really engaged and highly motivated community that always comes together and talks about the questions that you're interested in. And the way you do this is through, for instance, gamification of different kinds, using leaderboards. This is an example from the study that we ran, and we had the platform for collecting forecasts about the replicability of social science research. This was done with funding from DARPA, and we had all kinds of badges that you can gain by doing things on the platform. I don't know, there were dozens of badges. People got really excited about the badges. The participants were talking to each other about which badges they had. We had the leaderboards that showed performance across performance and number of badges across a period of time. People were really into all these gamification aspects of the platform and kept them really engaged, and we had a lot of repeat participants because of this. Secondly, a lot of these exercises where you systematically collect judgments also build on best practices in expert elicitation. So for instance, what we did in our study, and you see it on many other platforms in the research on forecasting, you anonymize participants' identity so that you don't get any pernicious social influence effects. You try to employ strategies to reduce the overconfidence of experts. What we did here was that we generated interval judgments rather than point judgments. We structured interaction in all kinds of ways in order to reduce pernicious social effects and get the wisdom of the crowd rather than the madness of the crowd. The idea here is that if we were to systematically collect judgments about the future of AI through these kinds of competitions, we could build a motivated, engaged community that employs the best practices to think about the future of AI, and there would be value in that. Another reason why you might want to organize these kinds of competitions where people talk to each other and predict the future of AI is that it will provide a great way for gathering feedback on performance and provide opportunities for learning. And this happens on two levels. First of all, when you're thinking about expertise in almost any domain, one of the key insights when people write and think about expertise is that people are not born experts, and then they don't remain experts for the entirety of their lives by not doing anything. Expertise is acquired and refined, and you need to engage in deliberate practice to gain it and maintain it. A systematic competition, long-term competition, predicting the future of AI can do that, can hone the expertise of forecasters by providing them feedback with how they performed, giving them the opportunity to learn and improve and adapt throughout the lifetime of the forecasting exercise. But it also is an opportunity for the people organizing the forecasting tournament to learn how to best elicit judgments about the future of AI. Seán already mentioned metaculus and manifold. There are different ways of structuring forecasts about the future. Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers had a different way of structuring forecasts about the future. We had a slightly different way of eliciting forecasts about the replicability of social science research. There are many ways of eliciting judgments about the future, and we just don't know what constellation of factors will lead to more accurate forecasts. So there is a value in allowing for a lot of experimentation where you try different interventions to see which one leads to a better outcome. And that was the core idea behind many of the really well-known forecasting competitions like IARPA-ACE, where Phil Tetlock developed his work, the DARPA SCORE program that I was a part of, and a few others that the ARPAs organized in the US, where they brought together teams that all applied different methods for eliciting the future of, eliciting judgments about the future. Finally, and I'll be very brief, I see Nando is already gesturing. The final reason why you might want to elicit forecasts, systematically elicit forecasts about the future of AI is because you can facilitate an exchange of view across communities. And that can happen in two ways. First of all, if you ever try to talk about probabilities with somebody, you might have run into this problem that was first noticed in writing, at least I'm sure people before, by Sherman Kent, who was a CIA analyst a while ago, who noticed that if you talk about the future using words, and if you talk about probabilities using words, you risk talking past each other. People have wildly different interpretations of the same phrases in natural language. So this is a graph based on his work. So he asked a bunch of NATO analysts to put numbers on different phrases he found in intelligence analysis reports. And as you can see, some people think that probable is actually less likely than what other people think better than even is. All have very different interpretations of what these words mean. Putting actual numbers on our judgments, putting it in numerical form can allow us to communicate and convey exactly what we have in mind. And finally, a lot of the forecasting competitions have to be interdisciplinary. Thinking about the future AI is something that machine learning experts could contribute to, but as well as people who work in legal studies. Talking across communities is difficult. We all use language in different ways. We all have concepts that sound the same in natural language, but they mean slightly different things. We all care about different things. Structuring that conversation between communities of practice, between stakeholders, between researchers around a very precise thing, which is a numerical prediction, can act as a good way of facilitating this kind of cross-cultural dialogue. So lots of reasons why predicting the future of AI, systematically generating predictions about AI futures is important. There are certain risks that can emerge if we're doing this. One of them is that although getting accurate predictions about the future of AI might lead to better governance, it's not clear to us that the reason why we don't have better AI governance is because we lack information. There might be other political and policy reasons why people don't act to create better and more effective governance of AI technologies rather than that they're just missing information about the future. And we might end up forecasting things that are more easily to forecast and that might anchor our decision making in the future. So there's some risks to generating a lot of predictions about the future. I'm thinking this is the right vehicle to effective governance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes for short questions. So, yeah, any question from the audience? Don't be shy again. Okay, over there.
Yes, thanks for the interesting talk. So I was wondering when you mentioned that human experts are kind of bad and making like these long-term predictions, and at the same time you showed that it was people with kind of diverse background, they are better. Can we employ AI to do the forecasting task? This foundation model type of AI, or what can you say about that?
Alex, any thoughts?
So maybe that could be, so I don't know, maybe, I have no idea. I don't think we have enough, a big enough data set in order to fine-tune a model to make those predictions. We need to organize more forecasting competitions to generate more data, and then maybe we can find, using an AI system, we can find who the experts are. But so far, I think in a lot of these competitions, what was obvious is that the people you'd think would be the best at predicting the future on different topics were really not the best at predicting the future. So the expertise was hidden in surprising places, and only the competitions were able to identify where the expertise actually was hidden. But yeah, fair enough. Maybe we can use an AI system to do that automatically for us. That would be great.
I actually think this is a really fun idea. I wonder if anyone's actually doing it. I want to ask my colleague from Metaculus about it. Seems to me that if we did have big enough data sets, this seems like a feasible thing. I mean, just like here are a bunch of forecasts, here are ones that we've labeled as good ones. Can you eventually come up with your own ones based on that? I would say that one of the big challenges of forecasting is not just doing the forecast, it's creating and crafting the questions, like turning things into like discrete questions that can be verified or disproven is a skill in of itself. And maybe again, that's something that AI could help us with, but it's a challenging thing in of itself. But it's a really fun idea.
Thanks very much for your amazing talks. I found very interesting the notion of super forecasters, and I was just wondering, through your research, did you find that perhaps they might have specific cognitive traits or a mental model? And if so, do you think there might be value in trying to kind of cultivate that in early education?
Ooh, interesting. So I didn't work on the super forecasting projects. That was Phil Tadlock's work in IRPACE a while ago, and he published a book on super forecasting and a lot of papers with Barbara Mellers and others. There were definitely signs that there is something special about the super forecasters, and so first of all, the way they got to super forecasting is first they cast the net quite widely to see who's better at forecasting geopolitical events. Then the most accurate forecasters were put together in super teams. Then they received training in debiasing. Then there were special algorithms for aggregating the individual judgments of the super forecasters into a collective judgment. So there were a lot of manipulations in order to get from the human judgment to the prediction. And that's how they ended up with very, very accurate predictions. But there's definitely evidence that there's something that happens within the super forecasting teams that allows them to perform better than others. One of the hypotheses they had, which I think has been supported by the data, is that if you're forecasting in an enriched environment, that tends to improve performance. So in the super forecasting teams, people commented more on each other's judgments. People brought in evidence from outside at a higher rate than in less performing teams, than in worse teams. Moreover, there were more comments and there was more engagement in those teams, so motivation seemed to play a huge role. There's also some evidence that people who perform really well tend to think in a certain way, tend to take an outside view on matters, tend to be more willing to update their judgments in response to new evidence. So there are definitely clues there as to what would make a good forecasters. And there's a lot of research still ongoing on what are the cognitive skills. I think there's a paper that they published last year on what are the cognitive abilities that would make one a good forecaster. That being said, I don't think we're at the level where we can actually test for those skills and derive from that with a lot of precision that the person would be a good forecaster or wouldn't be a good forecaster. I think so far track record is by far our best indication of who will perform well.
So thanks for a brilliant talk, Alex and Seán. And it's almost actually following on from your, and I'll be brief because we're right on the time, following on from that, like, this is coming from a perspective of a quantitative scientist, that is perhaps the utility of asking experts in the context of forecasting perhaps better spent asking them what variables we should be better measuring now so as to be able to improve prediction, rather than asking them for a prediction.
Yeah.
Because it seems that quite in a lot of kind of contexts, there's a lot of effort into collecting the opinions of experts about where things are going. And as you say, what makes them good is what data they use and how they take that into account. And there seems to be much less effort in actually collecting the data that we could use to predict the future.
Mm-hmm. So I think, sorry.
Go ahead. Basically, I was going to say that
seems right to me. I mean, I mentioned that one of the most interesting things in like looking at how forecasters come to their conclusions is the discussions and what data sources they pull in and the debates they have around it. And it seems to me that what
you're pointing out is exactly right, that then will sort of uncover gaps in the data that we have available in quite a powerful way. And so I basically think that's right, but I'll hand over to Alex.
No, I again agree with this. And I think, as Seán was saying in his presentation, sometimes the real value in eliciting judgments happens in the rationales that people provide for their judgments, not in the actual numerical estimate. But I would be careful saying that this is evidence that we should only get people together to chat about things. I think there is a value in getting them to put a precise estimate, and in trying to do that, they uncover what evidence is missing, what factors could play, what evidence we need to gather and collect, or where we would need to look for additional evidence. And I think the way of thinking about the numerical prediction can help us and can facilitate that kind of conversation. So maybe the way to think about this is that we shouldn't put too much emphasis on the actual numerical judgment, but eliciting a judgment could structure the conversation where the more interesting things happen.
Do we have time for more?
No. Sorry. We can chat afterwards.
Now we have the lining session, which is 10 minutes or something.